Good morning, good afternoon, good evening. It's Grant Cameron, and this is episode 7 from Stanton Friedman files. People have asked me since I started to get these files and broadcast them, when are you going to get to the good stuff? The majority of the stuff that's in the Stanton files is basically Stanton Friedman stuff. There's no, that I've found yet, no explosive document that unravels the UFO cover up. Stan was very open about what he was doing and really didn't keep many secrets. So a lot of the stuff we're going to see in the Stanton Friedman files is stuff that he has put out before it's public. But the stuff I'm going to show in this presentation is a little bit of the stuff I was looking to see when I got there. I was looking for certain names to find if Stanton had private conversations with certain people. And I did find some of them. We haven't gone through only a fraction of the material so far, but I did find some of those names. And what I wanted to see was conversations that were happening with Stanton Friedman and researchers outside the public view of everybody else. One of the names I was looking for is this name, is William Leparle. Now, most people in the UFO community will not know who he is. And that is because William always stayed under the radar. He worked sort of privately. I got his name. Not sure where I got his name from, but he was actually the guy that when I filed my Freedom Information Act request with the Clinton White House, when I got my 1,000 pages of material describing the Rockefeller Initiative, where Lawrence Rockefeller goes to the science advisor at the White House, and this correspondence goes back and forth between the two of them. It was actually William Leparle who filed the first FOIA. And what he told me when I first heard about it was that he had gotten actual material, that instead of them photocopying the documents, they'd actually sent him the actual real documents. And he maintained to me one of the documents had Bill Clinton's signature on it. So when I heard that he had these, and he was very scared, he thought it was a setup, because he had done some work with Ron Pandolfi, who's rumored to be the guy who runs the UFO Weird Desk at the CIA. And I knew that, and I had talked to him a little bit about what Ron was doing and the briefing that Ron had given to the Clinton science advisor. So when he got these documents, he figured it had been a setup, and he immediately mailed the documents back to the Freedom of Information Act request at the Office of Science and Technology Policy inside the White House, where the documents had come from. When I heard he had gotten, whatever it was, 250 pages or whatever it was, and then I heard that Bruce Maccabee had gotten 500 pages in his request, that's when I decided I would file my FOIA, and that's when I got, at first it was 990 pages or something, and I realized that there was a bunch of documents that seemed to be missing. I filed an appeal, and I got more material. So I got over 1,000 pages, but it was because of William Leparle filing the initial FOIA that I actually made my filing and obtained, which is now known as the Rockefeller Initiative documents from the Clinton White House. So because William had worked with Ron Pandolfi doing stuff, he had this contact sort of with the CIA, around the CIA, and he was doing a lot of sort of research just for his private interest. It wasn't stuff he didn't have a website, he wasn't publishing this stuff. And he had this background on the CIA. So I guess Stan had contacted him knowing that he had this connection. And William Leparle was helping Stan look for various documents inside the CIA, because Stan was after the CIA, believing that they had smoking gun documents that would prove the fact that we are not alone, that some flying saucers are real. So there's a letter that William Leparle sent And as I said, William Leparo was one of the names that I was looking for. I was very happy when I found his file because I knew that this is not just an ordinary researcher. This is a guy who worked in behind the scenes and knew an awful lot, and probably maybe 5% of the stuff he discovered has ever been made public. So one of the things that he had sent Stan was this very bizarre sort of article. I guess he was just sending him some material, whatever. And this was this defendant who pleads insanity and said space aliens made him kill 2 women. It was kind of an interesting little article. I figured I would just sort of stick it in here that this guy insisted that they had given him the instructions to do this killing. But some of these documents that he had sent Stan were these CIA documents. They're all blacked out. One of them was actually kind of interesting. It has this little thing on it that wasn't blacked out, which is actually pretty interesting. So here's what it says. Whoever it is, the US scientists believe that low magnetic fields do not have a serious effect on astronauts, but high magnetic fields, oscillating magnetic fields, and electromagnetic fields can or do have considerable effect. There's a theory that such fields are closely associated with superconductivity at very low temperatures, such as in space. This in turn is related to the possible propulsion system of UFOs. There is a rumor that fragments of a possible UFO found, and then that's the end of what was left in this document. But you have talks about UFO wreckage, you have talk about UFO propulsion, and this is in this CIA document that William Leparo sent to Stan. There was one a letter, and this one I've pulled. I'm a little bit sensitive to released letters where it really sort of gets ugly, and this is one of the letters that I have chosen to pull. Now, if you want to go look at the letter, you can go to the archives in Fredericton, New Brunswick, pull the file, and find it for yourself. But eventually, this thing will get out. But I've decided at this point, it was a lot of this fighting inside with various researchers, and so I've put it. I'll be putting it in my disclosure trust that I have with Michael Hall, a lawyer in Washington, where all my most sensitive material that will be released the day after I die. And so I've put this, and there'll probably be a few things that I'll stick in there that were a little too hot to sort of talk about in public. But if you want to see them, you know where the files are, you can go there. Or eventually we may put these files online with a university or someplace else. We'll stick these online, you can find them. But for now, I've pulled this one very sort of sensitive document. This is where it gets kind of interesting. I mentioned in my last presentation, there was a lot of documents in the Friedman files that had to do with Area 51 and Stanton Friedman's contention that the story was made up, and he has debated a number of people. And so I found a lot of this correspondence, and what I'm going to show today is one letter from George Knapp. This is sort of like letters that are going back between George Knapp, who was the main investigator on the case, and Stanton Friedman, I guess, who was the main sort of skeptic of the case. And it's a sort of a real honest sort of back and forth between these two men, describing why they believe what they believe. And I would say that reading the material, I agree with 99% of what George Knapp says. I came to the same conclusion, but there is a point to be made for Stan Friedman in that the Bob Lazar case is not a clean-cut case. It's very, very bizarre. It's not a simple fact that this guy was taken on there and to Area 51 and that it's all true. It almost looks like some sort of psychological operation where they're releasing material. That was my conclusion, that he had been on the base, but that a lot of this stuff was set up, that they wanted him to move this material. So Stan, he's written a number of articles where he basically, and I'll sort of outline, his position on Bob Lazar. And a lot of this does make sense, that a lot of what he's saying is sort of true, that there's these problems with the story. He basically says it's all bunk. He said Lazar did not have the 2 degrees he claimed, no diplomas, no resumes, no transcripts, no membership in professional associate organizations, no papers from MIT or Caltech yearbooks, a master's in science from physics from MIT requires a thesis. No such thesis exists at MIT, and he is not on a commencement list. He declared bankruptcy in the mid-1980s for almost $300,000. He listed his occupation then as a self-employed film processor. And as I will go through, George deals with all these things one at a time. At most, he worked only as a technician at Los Alamos. He worked for KM, not Los Alamos Labs. That's Kirk Meyer. The technology describes is wrong. His propulsion system scheme looks good, as do most science fiction stories, but it makes no real sense. He was charged with pandering. The 115 cannot be produced as it is unstable. His WT form from the Department of Naval Intelligence totals under $1,000, at most a week's pay for a scientist. George Knapp, we'll deal with that in a couple points, but in the letter I'm going to read, George doesn't really deal with that, but the whole point was that this is only for December of 1988, and Bob Lazar was not a full-time scientist. He was only on the base for a couple of days, and that's why it's under $1,000. It makes total sense. Lazar is not a scientist. He couldn't even answer scientific questions put to him. He had poor grades in high school and was only taking chemistry. So here's the letter. This is one of the long letters, and George Knapp goes through a lot of effort to deal with all these. This letter is like 5 pages long, and he goes through to Stan, and he tries to sort of explain to Stan why he believes what he believes about the case and why he's defending the Bob Lazar story. But first, here's a letter. Stan got a lot of letters, and he got a lot of letters from people who were fighting with him about the Area 51. This is one prime example. This guy sends him a letter, and he's very upset about the fact that Stan Friedman has gone up against Lazar and said he was a fraud. And here's what he said. I have a perplexing question and an observation I'd like to make. When I heard you on Larry King's special for the second time tonight, you stated that you do not believe Bob Lazar is telling the truth. I completely disagree, and I'm convinced his story is 100% true. I am an electrical engineer by education and practicing design engineer. I have carefully studied all of the material from or about the Lazar story. After hearing and seeing all the various statements which have been made, I would like to make the following points. And so he goes through all these points, basically telling Friedman, you got this wrong, you got that wrong, this is why I believe this. But this is just a guy off the street. The opinion of George Knapp is much more important because George Knapp was the guy who broke the story. If it hadn't been for George Knapp, there would be no Area 51 story. It had actually been given to John Lear already in December of 1988, and John Lear was running around talking about this guy that was working at the base on these flying saucers and was telling the story, but nobody would take John Lear serious. It was not until May of 1989 when George Knapp was missing a guest on his evening TV show and decided to bring Bob Lazar on. That's when the story went viral. So it was a story that George Knapp broke, and would not have occurred had George Knapp not taken interest and done the story on KLS TV in Las Vegas. So here's the letter that George sends to, this is dated 1995, and I've sort of pulled little segments out here which I'll read, which are kind of interesting, where it sort of tells George Knapp's side of the story. And as I said, I did this investigation. I wrote a book in 1990 where I dealt with the Area 51 story and Bob Lazar. And I basically came pretty much to the same conclusion that George did, that it's a very bizarre story. There's some things that don't make sense, but in terms of the basic story, something really did happen. He talks about concerning Lazar. I'm amazed at your stamina in responding to so many letters in so much detail. I have neither the time nor the inclination to answer all the mail I receive regarding the Area 51 story, and I'm impressed with your zeal. Some years ago, you and I agreed to disagree on this case. Obviously, we see it differently, but we both recognize that vigorous debate can be productive without necessarily degrading into personal rancor. I still feel this is the way. It would certainly be unfortunate if our disagreement on Lazar resulted in some sort of animosity that has developed between you and I, that is developed between you and Randall and Schmidt. I sincerely hope that it never happens, and I am confident it won't. But it's also difficult to ignore your increasing strident statements about the issues. So he says, that said, I want to tell you what's on my mind. So he starts to detail his view based upon claims that Stan is making about the case. Correct me if I'm wrong, but you admittedly misrepresented yourself to the school in order to get information which by law cannot be given out. In other words, you lied to the school in hopes of getting information about Bob. You say the school told you Lazar was in the bottom third of his class only took one science course. School officials gave out this information by phone to a perfect stranger, even though it's a crime to do so. I have recorded conversations with those same school officials. They vigorously, fervently deny ever telling you or anyone else about Bob's grades. I know for a fact that you have misrepresented information which has been given to you concerning Lazar. The prime example, a man approached you after a Los Alamos lecture and said, so you're saying Bob Lazar is a con man? You replied, that's a good way to put it. The next time we hear about this conversation, you are telling a radio audience that someone who knew Lazar at Los Alamos told you he was a con man. I know about the man you talked to. I have a recording of your radio statements. The man was a friend of Lazar's and insisted that Lazar really worked for Los Alamos and as a scientist in classified projects. He did not say Lazar is a con man. Those were your words, and they were contrary to the opinion of this guy who knew Bob. I would like to hear your response on this. You have been very critical of Lazar because he can't document. This is a good one. I didn't realize this until I read the letter. You have been very critical of Lazar because he can't document parts of his story. What is the difference between his inability to prove his statements and your inability to do the same? And that is the point, that every UFO researcher cannot really prove his point. And so we're holding this against Lazar when we have the same situations ourselves. You admit that you lied in order to get the information in the first place. So why are we supposed to take your word for it, especially in light of the repeated denials from the school? I'd like to hear your specific answer to these questions. Go to page 3. Your litany about Bob's lack of academic and professional credentials is now so familiar that I can almost recite it word for word. In your letters and speeches, you make it sound as if this is some deep, dark secret, a shocking revelation which you and others somehow discovered. Allow me to remind you that this information was contained in the very first report that I aired about Lazar. The report made it clear that Lazar's education and employment claims could not be confirmed. The fact that you and others have reconfirmed the obvious is a testament to your thoroughness, but it did not advance the discussion whatsoever. We can't prove he ever went to school at Caltech or MIT, a fact that was widely broadcast in the November 1989 show. As I've said many times, publicly and privately, Lazar's educational claims have always been the weakest part of his story. The same argument applies to his Los Alamos records. You called the lab a few years ago and got the same response that I received in the beginning. Agreed, the phone book and newspaper don't prove the story by themselves. But I can tell you flat out that Los Alamos Labs screwed me for 2 years concerning his records. Kirk Meyer did the same. They told me that they had his files and promised to send them, then refused to take my calls or answer my letters. After another year, they told me the records had been destroyed. Odd for a company which is in the business of finding jobs for scientific and technical personnel. I've been a reporter for a long time, and I know when I'm being jacked around. Both the lab and Kirk Meyer repeatedly lied and stalled. Do you have an alternative explanation for the response or lack thereof? If so, I'd like to hear it. You, of all people, can recognize when you're being given a runaround by bureaucrats and underlings. Some of your other remarks about Lazar are truly unworthy of someone who has taken so many unfair shots himself over the years. You mention his bankruptcy and the $300,000 debt. He borrowed the money from the bank in hopes of establishing a small business. The fact that the business failed doesn't mean he's a con man. Many businesses fail. Many people declare bankruptcy. My own finances are a wreck, and I guess that yours wouldn't look too flattering if an army of debunkers wanted to dig up every tax return, credit report, or bounce check dating back to 1982. Be fair. Just because a person declares bankruptcy doesn't mean that he's a con man. Then he says, and then Stanton talks about him making money on his story. He says, just because someone is making money isn't automatically bad either, is it? You sold books, papers, tapes, and tickets to lectures for a lot of years, right? Are you cashing in on the topic? Exploiting it? If a person makes money, is he a con man? Is there a difference in this respect between you and Lazar other than the dollar figures? Please respond. Lazar told me in our first interview that the mainstream scientists, this is about the propulsion system. It told me in our first interview that mainstream scientists wouldn't like to embrace his story. So what? As an aside, Dr. Jack Kasher has told me that he thinks the propulsion system as described does make sense. I consider his credentials as a physicist to be at least the equal of your own. Now the 115. He deals with the 115. As for element 115, you are correct in stating that it would be nearly impossible to create such a substance. Lazar used exactly the same words in our initial interview. As you'll recall, he specifically argued that 115 could not be manufactured here because of the incredible amounts of energy needed. He said it was a natural element from somewhere else. As for the German team, which created element 1110, you might be interested to know that they have been communicating with Lazar for several months and consider his input to be extremely valuable and perfectly consistent with their own research. I've seen the correspondence. They were in communication before the creation of 1110 and have repeatedly invited Bob to visit them to share information. Again, I would say that their scientific credentials are at least equal to your own. Now, this has to do with the Jacques Vallée having an interaction with Bob Lazar. And he says, concerning Jacques Vallée, his opinion about Lazar's story has been batted around for quite some time now. A few people have stated it correctly, including you. I arranged the meeting between Vallée and Lazar and interviewed Vallée immediately afterward. What he said was that he did not believe Lazar was lying. It was never stated that Vallée accepted the entire story. Admittedly, his initial impression may have evolved since the 1990 meeting. Vallée is convinced that the Area 51 controversy has been manufactured as some sort of psychological exercise, and that Lazar may have been used as a part of that effort. But he was quite clear in stating that he didn't think Lazar was knowingly lying. Your statement, another scientist present when Bob was interviewed did not accept Bob's story, is completely false, since the only other people who were at the meeting were TV producers, not scientists. You repeatedly stated that there isn't a shred of evidence, a shred of proof to support Lazar. It makes for a nifty soundbite, but it simply isn't true. Lazar took groups of people out to the desert on 3 consecutive weeks to witness the flights of glowing discs. This is something that I mentioned numerous times in the times I've talked about it, is this is one of the real big things that has to be explained about Bob Lazar if you believe he's a hoax, is how did he know about these 3 tests? How did he know when they were testing the object unless they told him? And he was only working part-time, which would indicate they told him for a reason. They wanted him to take people. And as George Knapp points out, the fact is that they actually taped on the first night. They actually got it on tape. And there was a pile of witnesses. This is not 1 or 2 people. This was, I think, 5 or 6 people at every event when he took them, and exactly when Bob said the test would take place is exactly when it took place. Here's the polygraph test. Now, a lot of people are saying that the polygraph guy was a friend of of George Knapp. This clears this up. He passed the polygraph test. The polygrapher is a former police officer and respected professional who had never met either me or Lazar prior to the test. He said Lazar isn't lying. Two other polygraphers looked at the charts and agreed with the findings. Bob willingly agreed to take these tests, and while the results are not usable in a court of law, it's also true that we aren't in a court of law, in a court, are we? How did he pass? Could you if you were lying? An electrical engineer who worked at Area 51 grilled Lazar for a few hours about insignificant details concerning the base. Where's the cafeteria? How do you pay for the meals? What's that sort of thing? Bob answered correctly. He also knew about the EG&G connection, the manner to which employees were screened, hired, and transported to work. He knew the name of Mike Friedman, the agent who interviewed him at his home, an agent who worked for the intelligence agency, which isn't even listed in the Las Vegas phone book, but which does, in fact, conduct background checks on people hired to work on classified projects at the test site and Nellis. Two people witnessed Thigpen at Bob's house. Now, how do we explain this? At least 3 people say Lazar worked at Los Alamos on classified projects. 2 people say he attended classes at Caltech. 5 people say he took them to witness test flights of the disc. 2 people say they saw a federal agent at his house. 3 polygraphers say that he's telling the truth. An engineer who worked at Area 51 said Bob was familiar with details he couldn't have known otherwise. After asking for Lazar's records, a U.S. congressman, whose name was Bill Bray, said he had never seen similar stonewalling by the government agencies. I'd like your response to these items. If you can reply on desperate witnesses, first, second, third, 45 years removed from the Roswell event to prove your case. Why is such testimony to be disregarded in this case? I'd like to hear your response. As I've stated before, one of the clinchers for me was the final court appearance following his brothel involvement. Now, this, I think it was 1991 when this charge took place. Since you weren't here, you simply don't know what it was like. The parole and probation department wanted to give him 6 months in prison. They called it evaluation time because they were angry about their inability to verify his background. He was facing a maximum of 60 years, Stan. And I'm telling you, they were serious. If he would ever have been caught in a lie, he would have done hard time. Yet he stuck to his story. He told them where he had worked and what he had done. The judge agreed that it was one of the most unusual cases he had ever dealt with and gave a lenient sentence. Did Guy Kirkwood or Frank Stranges or any other phonies you cite ever face prison time for their lies? Please don't quibble with me here. It was at my insistence that Bob admitted to his crime, and it certainly would have been easier and wiser for him to admit that he was lying. That's not what happened. If there's a similar case, enlighten me. Now here's the final page. After being involved with this subject for so long, you can certainly know that everything isn't what it seems. If documents can be forged, they can be erased. If backgrounds can be created, they can also be falsified. If intelligence agencies can spy on you, infiltrate your lectures, bug your phone, withhold your own records, disseminate disinformation, and otherwise screw with your life, what's the limit? I have considerable experience in recognizing con men of all flavors. Las Vegas, after all, is the scam capital of the world, and I've met more than my share in the past decade or so. It is my fervent and sincere belief that you are wrong about him. I have come to know him on a close personal level, and while I will admit that he is an unusual man, I'm convinced beyond reasonable doubt that he is not willfully lying about the S4 information. It is entirely possible that the people out there screwed with his head, but I feel very strongly your con man allegations are wrong. And then Stan mentions there's going to be some new attacks from California. As to your mention of a threatened expose by some people in California, who cares? Lazar has already taken low blows from every direction and is unlikely to lose any sleep over a few new ones. The central question for you and others seems to be, is Bob a scientist? The central question for me is, did he work on an alien spacecraft? Those are different questions. And even if he had all the degrees and published papers and associations, which you are also always demanding, I seriously doubt whether such information would be enough to convince you that he worked at S4 on alien technology. And that's that letter. And here's another one where I'm just going to pull one thing and then I'll end it for now. There's a lot more of this correspondence between these two, but here's another letter which is dated a little bit earlier, 1992, just after the story broke. I mentioned while you were here, I have high hopes that our friend in Moscow will soon have in his possession the original Russian report on Roswell. I will keep you fully informed of our progress. In addition, I'll keep you posted concerning the Eisenhower White House source who is preparing to come forward. Now, this is as close as you get to smoking gun thing. This sort of reference to cases that people are working on. And I assume that they didn't come forward, but I'll leave it for that. Thanks for listening, and we will go to more documents in the next session.